Let's Google some art, landscape drawing, and we're not going to get much. Or maybe I should say we're going to get too much. We're not going to give us something that indicates there are forms or techniques that can guide us in landscape drawing. We're going to get a lot of variety, as if everybody wants to draw landscapes, but they're searching and just can't seem to get there. We're not going to get to the point where we sense that there's practical approaches to landscape drawing that have been recognized and accepted. Although I could point out strengths and qualities in any of the drawings we see, and sometimes even our simplest, primitive, naive, innocent approaches to drawing are valid and intuitively correct, even if they're not highly developed. But I want to take the approach that there are things to be learned and known about drawing, and that we have accomplished something real and solid that we can look at and point to in the history of art, in the few thousand years that we have thought about art as a practice. So instead of landscape drawing here, Da Vinci, which I can get bigger for you, where there's something a little more standard and traditional, connected with other forms of drawing, connected with other approaches and attitudes, philosophies about drawing that we could look into and make connections, can relate to and can understand rationally and not just intuitively. I'm going to cut to the chase here, and I'm going to go to Rembrandt landscape drawings, and we're going to see a lot. And if I just keep scrolling here, I probably won't get to the bottom of it. And I assure you that these are not all repeats of the same drawing. And the quantity here is our first clue that Rembrandt has arrived at something that is not just practical, but organic, fluid, adaptable, repeatable, and I would say spontaneous, in that he's able to go out and directly filter what information he needs to find to show us very distinct, individual, independent scenes wherever he went. And this is because he enjoyed landscape drawing so much. He was not a landscape painter. He did it as an avocation and a outlet to his religious and historic and portrait work, and for his own enrichment. Look at the resolution on that. That's worth looking into more, so we'll open that up. And we get something that's very concise in a sort of shorthand that tells us all we need to know. So he's taken reality here and distilled it down to basics that we'd be well advised to note for ourselves. Specifically, the kinds of line work that Rembrandt uses, and I'm going to call this a scalloped, curly kind of line to indicate foliage forms, and broad washes of minimal tones in order to give us some sense of values and pull the piece together. We may come back to this drawing, but we can find the same elements in simpler drawings, and this looks like it may be a decent enough size to look at enlarged also. And I think right off the bat, we recognize that this is not as finished or detailed a piece, that the speed with which it's done, that its quickness is its whole point and is acceptable and admirable in that regard. But we see the same elements playing out, and we get no less a sense compared to that one of a particular place that we could imagine clearly while filling in the missing details for ourselves. And those elements are going to be the same kind of scalloped lines with very ordinary kinds of representation of the architecture. And also, and this is important, certain sloping lines and irregular kinds of contour lines that indicate the lay of the land itself and the different horizontal levels on which the building and the water and the shore and different areas of foliage rest. In that it is an indication of bare ground not covered by foliage. We don't see general tones on this drawing, and I don't feel a need to explain that, but it's okay, and we can see easily that if Rembrandt progressed with this a little more, they could be added. The idea here is that not everything would be shaded and not everything can be shaded in a landscape drawing. It does look like there's some tonality in the shadow or inset parts of the building, and there is a sense of cross-hatching over the darker sides of some of these trees and underneath, and I'm just going to call that, we'll call it hatching since it's not actually crossed. And these are all drawings that are easily brought up. There's many here that fit this same mold in the discussion at this point. So let's bring up this one. And this one's even looser. We have a bridge in the center of the midground, and there's a person on a horse crossing that bridge and a person on the road that would lead along the bank into the foreground here. And this, my God, it looks like some kind of Daumier drawing or something. It's looser, and it's about as loose as Rembrandt gets, probably, because it's about as loose as I could get or anybody. My reference to Daumier as a loose draftsman. But again, it's a space that we can easily imagine and accept and project into. So there's a wide range of abilities that Rembrandt is tapping into and demonstrating right off the bat here. Similar elements, and we have this scalloped curly line, and that's worth looking into in terms of technique, because I want to say it's not easy, and they do have very particular characteristics that make them distinct from the other kinds of architectural or ground lines or even the figures in this piece. And I think it's those characteristics, the effort to execute them, that are the point. And they click with us in a certain way that's instinctual for us to perceive what they're meant to describe here, meant to portray. It's interesting to note that in terms of this drawing, because without that, a system like this breaks down. And it doesn't have to be completely unsuccessful, but it's interesting and it's amusing to point out, because often when we look at landscape drawings like this, the system does break down. And we have foliage lines here over on the right that are not as distinct as some of the others. Here's some very careful tight lines, particularly in the midground, even in these trees, which are a little farther back. These trees, and then we see swooping, kind of out of control lines on the right side here. I think we even see some actual loopy squiggles down here, where we could imagine our own hand getting a little reckless and crazy and not being able to execute properly the kinds of billowing directional forms we're talking about. The fact that that breaks down at times shows us, indicates that there is a particular intention behind how these drawings are done that is in fact powerful and effective. We're going to go to this, and maybe it's larger. There's a good large one where the sky has been cut off, but we get a nice clear view of this drawing. Much more scratchy lines, actually. A lot of these drawings were done with a reed pen, which Rembrandt actually would have carved from some kind of reed. Reed means a hollow wooden tubular plant such as bamboo, or I'm not a botanist, growths that he could have carved and made into a point that would hold ink. So this shows that kind of effect a little more than the previous drawings. And it shows this wash of very simple tone. Little cross-hatching here and there, but it's kept to a minimum. And that's so it doesn't interfere with the other kinds of very carefully done line types. Get too many lines going at once, and you can imagine the overall effect being lost. So we'll go and we'll look at some tighter Rembrandt landscapes, but it's nice to start here because we can see what happens when, I get lost. Happens in an elementary way when the basics are brought together. And again, I'd like to draw attention to the speed with which this is done and what you may be able to see as the differences in successful and exciting line types versus areas where, again, it gets out of hand. It's nice to criticize Rembrandt, isn't it? None of this is meant to diminish his drawings or his accomplishments, but in fact to better appreciate them and appreciate the challenges that he is taking on, that he does master often, and to be able to reflect on our own experiences as we might try something like this, because I guarantee you that you will gain a greater appreciation for why this difference in quality per se happens and is inevitable and can be tolerated and accepted. Maybe we can come to this one. This one for the architecture particularly, where these structures, these buildings, take on such character, even though they're more of a geometric kinds of forms, that they do have these thatched roofs and rough-hewn construction materials. The beautiful organic nature of them that must have made for just charming kind of landscape in Holland at the time. Beautiful drawing from loose on the right-hand side to more tight on the left. And it looks like we have a tree in spring where we see these flowing kinds of vertical lines that represent branches and just the slightest amount of foliage that fills out ultimately what would be tree-like forms, meaning a tree is a lollipop, right? We have a trunk and have the crown of leaves, and it's just starting to be indicated because of the time of year in this drawing. Just click on this. And here we see a scene, I believe it's called The Wind, where there's a lot of dexterity and consistency across this very woodsy kind of scene on the bank of the river, I assume, or Pond or Lake, with trees in full foliage, with a bare ground bank that slopes down to the shore, and some indication, mostly by horizontal and vertical lines, angled lines of the roof, of a structure tucked into that thicket, that grove of trees. And we see everything from an actual curly line here on the left, and somewhat looser lines as we get over to the left side, to many lines that I could actually draw on screen with you another time, but that register as a hand movement that probably took just a moment to do 1, 2, 3 loops and then move on to show another cluster of leaves. And we will see that all over. And most of these are directed towards the right, and that's how we get the sense of wind in this drawing. And we have beautiful area central, more in the sunlight on the left side of this large tree that's in the foreground, that are just dashes of comma-shaped curved lines that are very vigorous and almost connecting, so we get the sense of the same kind of movement, but that the pen is picked up between each line, which makes it a little lacier, a little more open effect than when it gets more closed. And here on the right side we see a tree that's much denser, smaller lines that are all connected. Completely engaging and picturesque, and I think clues us into why Rembrandt enjoyed doing this kind of thing so much. Probably a very unusual barn kind of structure next to or attached to a dwelling behind on a distinct little hill overlook, the road below. Foliage forms themselves, beautiful thin washes of color that play over the landscape like light. Same way the Impressionists would have viewed a scene. And I think it's the ability to capture that impression of what Rembrandt encountered and what attracted him as he walked the countryside, depicted in these drawings that give them the appeal. We can imagine him coming home with drawings, laying them out, and feeling that he's made the world familiar, and that through art he's gained a kind of control over the environment and the surroundings that I think would have appealed to his fellow countrymen. Again, the vigorousness of a scene like this is really incredible, just so amazing and enjoyable as a piece of artwork. This is a more refined piece, and it's an etching. If you do some research on your own, I want to point out that this would have been done in a studio. We're talking about blades etching into copper and eventually printing multiple versions. Looking at Rembrandt, we might come across this image or others that are denser like this. Etchings also extensively worked on drawings in order to get this kind of tightness through many editions and many techniques to get the tonalities, the washes, and a buildup of effects, almost mind-boggling, but part of the printing process. I'd like to touch on two other artists that accentuate the same kind of images in their work, and one is John Constable. And Constable was actually a landscape painter. Okay, so what I'm doing now is actually showing class materials that I use for my students because I wasn't able to get to the Constable drawings that I was looking for in any efficient way. I can't be here all day through Google, even though I have before. And Constable can be easily recognized as sharing the same techniques as Rembrandt, even though working 2 centuries later, and the techniques in these drawings have not changed a whole lot, except that we do see pencil lines behind the ink lines often. We see slightly different hand of Constable, but we also see the distinctive kinds of line quality, and probably overall we see Constable a little tighter than Rembrandt, a little more expressive and particular about each line that he draws, whether that's a strength or a weakness of his drawings. Notice the jagged lines of the mountains, the rocks, versus the kind of puffy lines of the foliage. And we get drawings here that are just about the sense of place that comes from juxtaposing these different kinds of lines. I use the word puffy. That's what trees do. They fluff out. And we are evolved to perceive our environment, the spaces around us, automatically in an instant without being conscious of it. So we can imagine evolving biologically as creatures needing to be in tune, needing to understand and react to our surroundings, perhaps in an artistic way, but also in survival mode, reliably, without interference, all the time, perhaps in hunting mode, fight or flight mode, operating on what we may call our lower brain, our basic functions. Ah, beautiful drawing. And for Constable, what he's doing, and maybe this is the culmination of all the things we're talking about, is that he's directing his lines and depicting his subject matter in terms of what he would have thought of as forces rather than things. And these forces were articulated and come down to the writings of his contemporary John Ruskin, the philosopher, writer, artist in the 1800s, who also wrote about drawing and drawing the landscape in terms of two forces, the forces of growth and the forces of decay, or life and death, which he said ruled all of nature. And I think that he's onto something. I think he has something there. And what that results in is two types of lines. The lines of life that extend upward are organic and flowing as life defies gravity and reaches for the sky. And the kinds of lines that result from erosion, gravity, disintegration, forces that bring life and the landscape back down. And those lines tend to be jagged, irregular, and even more geometric than the others. And if Ruskin is right and he's tapping into something fundamental and universal, then that's what's going to allow us to grasp that and create in a manner that's consistent with how the world is created around us. That should register with us and would be our ideal goal as artists, drawing the landscape anyway. The fact that Constable can come up with scenes like this, or this, which are divorced from particularities, but still embody everything about the landscape that we need to respond to on a gut level, proves that there's something to these methods, that they're legitimate and worth coming back to. For my classes, I call this a photo dump at the end of an assignment as examples, and I include my own work. In all modesty, as further proof that these techniques can be useful to ordinary artists such as myself. And these are ink and wash drawings done in the countryside around me. Ha, my tent. A view from the top of Mount Washington in New Hampshire. And even more so, I don't have a great tablet, I don't have a precise pen or anything up to date, but used to do with a clunky stylus primitive landscape drawings. And these would be analogous to the inability to control these techniques for precision or to be tight, and yet still the effectiveness of the same principles, the same techniques with washes of tone and the elementary forces in nature playing out to understand landscape on a basic level. And I'll finish with this drawing by, I believe, Agostino Carracci, one of the Carracci brothers, Annibale and Agostino. I think it's by Agostino, but I could be wrong. Which is, in fact, 16th century, I believe, Baroque period, older than the previous drawings we've been talking about, and indicating the long tradition, the historic understanding of these techniques, and the historic implementation of these techniques going back centuries, while at the same time being incredibly consistent. We can go from a more modern, generally, artist like Constable back to a more Renaissance artist, type artist like Carracci, and see that they're thinking and doing the same things with these curly kinds of lines and with these more jagged, decaying types of lines. It's always the same. It's the forces. You'll notice that little bushes are done the same as trees, mountains are done the same as rocks in the foreground. And what we're talking about ultimately is a feeling that we get from nature that we're drawing while letting our understanding of nature take care of itself. We are getting down to the core of things. We're letting ourselves get involved, engulfed by nature, knowing that there's something inherent in us that allows us to make sense of it at the same time. And that's really a beautiful combination of abilities that lets us thrive as artists and as humans. All right, so that was a wild journey. I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to cut this all apart and hopefully have a thread that's easy to follow enough throughout this with some good visuals and perhaps inspiring or useful to any of you who want to go out and draw the landscape, either on a beautiful day like it is here today and should be this afternoon, or for yourselves at any time. And we'll come back to this sometime, and we'll refer to it at times. You may already want to think about it in terms of the last video on the Hudson River School painters, but at least that's a start. So thanks for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll come up with something new and different next time, and I hope to see you there then. Thanks. Gary Jacobs, Googling Art.